In the depths of human history, there are figures so shrouded in darkness that their very mention chills the soul. They walk the line between myth and nightmare, their deeds echoing through time like ghostly whispers of horror. In the abyss of Auschwitz, among the choking fog of death and despair, one man's shadow loomed larger than the rest. His name was Dr. Josef Mengele, called the Angel of Death. A physician not of healing but of unimaginable suffering. A man who wielded his scalpel as a weapon of terror, etching scars into both flesh and history itself. Tonight, we unveil the life of a man who redefined the boundaries of cruelty. This is the story of Josef Mengele, the monster of Auschwitz. Origins of a monster. Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in the Bavarian town of Günzburg, Germany. The firstborn of Karl and Walburga Mengele, his arrival followed 3 tragic miscarriages, a fact that only heightened the adoration he received from his stern yet devoted mother. Karl Mengele, the patriarch, owned a thriving farm equipment factory, a business that provided young Joseph with a privileged upbringing. Yet, beneath the family's affluence lay a rigid and unyielding structure. Walburga, an imposing woman with a voracious appetite for control, ruled the household with an iron hand. For Joseph, his mother's approval became both his compass and his burden. As a child, Joseph was quiet, introverted, and deeply obedient. But this compliance masked an intense desire to please, a trait that would later manifest in chilling ways. Though an average student, he demonstrated a capacity for determination and focus, traits that became evident when he battled osteomyelitis, a severe bone marrow disease, at the age of 15. The illness kept him out of school for 6 months, but Joseph returned with a newfound drive, quickly surpassing his peers academically. By 17, the shy boy had transformed into a confident and driven young man. Known for his charm and sharp appearance, Joseph was admired by classmates and teachers alike. But beneath the polished exterior lay an ambition that would lead him down a path of unimaginable darkness. The seeds of ideology. In April 1930, Josef Mengele enrolled at Munich University, where he studied medicine and philosophy. The university was not just an academic space. It was a fertile ground for political ideologies that thrived in the post-World War I turmoil of Germany. The National Socialist, Nazi, Party was gaining momentum, and Joseph found himself drawn to its message of racial purity and national resurgence. Initially joining the paramilitary group Stahlhelm, Steel Helmets, a precursor to the Nazi Party, Mengele began to embrace the party's core tenets. The concept of eugenics, a pseudoscience advocating selective breeding to enhance human traits, particularly captivated him. He believed that science could engineer a perfect population by eliminating so-called undesirable traits. It was a dangerous ideology that found fertile ground in Joseph's mind and would later drive his atrocities. In 1935, Mengele earned a PhD in anthropology from the University of Munich. His thesis, titled Racial Morphological Research on the Lower Jaw Section of 4 Racial Groups, sought to establish scientific proof of racial hierarchies. Notably, the paper avoided overt racial bias, a facade of legitimacy that belied the dark undercurrents of his beliefs. The following year, Mengele obtained his medical degree and began working under Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, a leading figure in genetics and eugenics, at the Institute for Heredity Biology and Racial Purity in Frankfurt. Here, Mengele's research took a sinister turn. He examined individuals accused of violating the Nuremberg laws, documenting racial characteristics to determine Jewish ancestry. This work laid the groundwork for the systematic dehumanization that would define his later career. Embracing the Nazi machine. By 1937, Mengele officially joined the Nazi Party, aligning his ambitions with its monstrous vision. A year later, he took the oath of loyalty to the Schutzstaffel, SS, Heinrich Himmler's elite paramilitary organization. The SS was more than a symbol of Aryan supremacy, it was the operational backbone of Hitler's genocidal machinery. Membership was exclusive, reserved for those who epitomized the Nazi ideal of racial purity. During this time, Joseph became engaged to Irene Schonbein, the daughter of a prominent professor. Their union was almost derailed when Irene couldn't fully prove her Aryan heritage, a stark reminder of the Nazis' fanatical obsession with lineage. Only the influence of the Mengele family ensured their marriage in July 1939, though their exclusion from the SS Kinship Book, a registry of racially pure couples, was a lasting stain on Joseph's record. As war erupted across Europe, Mengele's star rose within the Nazi hierarchy. He was a man of science, charm, and loyalty to the regime, a combination that positioned him for greater infamy. Auschwitz, the theater of evil. In May 1943, Josef Mengele was assigned to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most notorious of the Nazi concentration camps. It was here that he earned his macabre moniker, the Angel of Death. Auschwitz was not merely a death camp. It was an industrial complex of horror where systematic extermination coexisted with grotesque experiments. For Mengele, Auschwitz was not a place of despair, it was a laboratory. His role. As Mengele's reign of terror continued, his experiments reached depths of barbarity that defied comprehension. Pain and suffering were not unfortunate byproducts of his studies, they were the very essence of his work. Children were subjected to operations without anesthesia, enduring unimaginable agony as their organs were removed or their limbs were amputated. In one particularly grotesque procedure, dyes were injected directly into their eyes in a twisted attempt to alter their iris color, aiming to achieve the so-called Aryan ideal. The outcomes of these experiments were as horrific as their intent: permanent blindness or excruciating infections, leading to prolonged suffering and inevitable death. One of Mengele's favored methods for torment involved endurance tests designed to measure how much pain a human body could endure before succumbing to death or unconsciousness. These tests often included exposure to electric shocks of escalating intensity. He pushed the limits of his victims' bodies until their fragile forms could take no more. If a subject survived, they were discarded as though their humanity had already been extinguished. Mengele's obsession with twins was particularly sinister. If one twin died during his experimentation, the other was immediately killed to allow for comparative autopsies. This perverse pseudoscientific method had no justification beyond his own macabre curiosity and lust for control. The twins, whose bond was a source of solace in the hell of Auschwitz, were often the focus of his cruel games. Their humanity was stripped from them, leaving only their suffering as a record of their existence. But his depravity extended beyond the laboratory. Mengele's duties in Auschwitz were not confined to medical experiments. He also conducted the infamous selections. When trains arrived overflowing with terrified prisoners, he stood at the center of the chaos, pointing left or right. Left meant immediate death in the gas chambers, while right signified a slower demise through forced labor or experiments. To Mengele, this decision was nothing more than a clinical sorting process. Even pregnant women were not spared his cruelty. If he discovered a woman was with child, her fate was sealed. Those nearing full term had their babies delivered only to be sent to their deaths moments later. On occasion, Mengele allowed both mother and child to live temporarily, only to tape the mother's breast so the infant would starve in front of her. It was an unthinkable torment designed to destroy not just their bodies but their very souls. Mengele's sadism reached its peak during one of his most heinous acts. In an incomprehensible display of cruelty, he ordered a massive pit to be dug within Birkenau and filled it with burning fuel. Into this fiery abyss, he had 300 children, none older than 5 years, thrown alive. Their cries echoed through the camp as prisoners and guards alike bore witness to his monstrous deeds. Unlike many of his fellow Nazi officers, Mengele's atrocities did not stem from drunkenness or coercion. Jewish survivors who were forced to assist in his laboratory described him as disturbingly enthusiastic about his work. His cruelty wasn't a means to an end, it was the end itself. Even the slightest annoyance could provoke him into a murderous rage. Mengele was often accompanied on his rounds by Irma Gries, a young SS guard known for her own sadistic tendencies. Together, they paraded through the camp, embodying the chilling image of Nazi supremacy. Their pristine uniforms belied the filth of their actions, presenting a facade of order and control while their actions embodied chaos and destruction. Despite his contempt for the Jewish prisoners, Mengele was not immune to other human impulses. On one occasion he became infatuated with a 15-year-old Jewish girl. His twisted desire for her culminated in an experiment so horrific that by the time he was done, she no longer resembled a young woman but an old, deformed figure. The girl was left to die, her agony a testament to Mengele's insatiable cruelty. By early 1945, the tide of war was turning against the Nazis. The crematoria were destroyed in a futile attempt to erase evidence of their crimes, and prisoners were forced on death marches away from the advancing Soviet forces. Mengele, ever resourceful in his efforts to escape justice, began to dismantle his operation. He destroyed records, packed up his equipment, and vanished from Auschwitz on January 17, 1945, just days before the camp was liberated by Soviet forces. When the Red Army arrived, they found Auschwitz in ruins, a grim testament to the horrors that had taken place. Among the debris, thousands of emaciated survivors stumbled through the camp, their bodies bearing the marks of starvation and brutality. Mengel's laboratory was a charred wasteland, but the stories of his victims ensured that his crimes would not be forgotten. Yet, Mengele was not finished evading justice. He fled to another concentration camp before eventually ditching his SS uniform and posing as a regular German soldier. Captured briefly by the Allies, he escaped identification and was released. 4 years he wandered through post-war Germany, always looking over his shoulder. After escaping from the Allies, Mengele's years of evasion played out like a nightmarish game of hide and seek. He moved through Europe, shifting identities, dodging Nazi hunters, and adopting a false sense of normalcy in a world forever altered by his war crimes. 4 years he lived in South America, where he was granted asylum in Argentina and later fled to Paraguay and Brazil, continuing to live free despite his heinous past. Mengele's status as one of the most wanted men in history should have ensured he never found peace. However, it was the shadows of his crimes that continued to haunt him more than any legal pursuit. His eventual death in Brazil in 1979, allegedly by drowning after suffering a stroke, seemed almost anticlimactic in comparison to the terror he once inflicted. The fact that he was able to evade justice for so long remains a point of historical controversy and distress. His story is one of chilling complexity. He was a man who had committed unspeakable atrocities, yet was afforded refuge in countries sympathetic to former Nazis. Even though he was one of the most infamous war criminals, his escape speaks to the wider failure of post-war justice systems, especially in regions like South America where Nazi sympathies lingered. In analyzing Mengele's evasion, it's clear that his survival and freedom posed critical questions about accountability in the post-war era. The Cold War, with its geopolitical power struggles, meant that many Nazi war criminals, including Mengele, were allowed to slip through the cracks. Governments, both in Europe and in South America, often turned a blind eye to the horrors of the Holocaust as they faced the global pressures of the New World Order. Mengele's ability to elude capture for so many years speaks volumes about the complexities of global justice and the aftermath of the Holocaust. Books such as The Angel of Death, The Story of Josef Mengele by David Jean Marwell and Mengele, The Complete Story by Gerald L. Posner and John Ware delve into these issues, shedding light on his flight and the people who helped him escape. These works explore how the larger political landscape of the time often took precedence over the moral obligation to bring criminals to justice. Mengele's case also illuminates the broader issues of the Nazi escape routes, often known as Ratlands, that provided sanctuary to many war criminals after World War II, including other infamous figures like Adolf Eichmann and Klaus Barbie. Mengele's life after the war mirrors the global failure to reckon with the full scope of Nazi atrocities. His ultimate death without facing a trial left many questions unanswered, and his story has become emblematic of the larger historical struggle for justice. How can we, as a global society, reconcile the failure to bring such figures to justice? His death does not erase the harm he caused. Even in his passing, Mengele's crimes continue to echo through history. The chilling reality is that his absence from the courtrooms of history means that justice was never fully realized for the victims of Auschwitz and beyond. Mengele's legacy is one defined by his role as an architect of cruelty, a symbol of how human intellect can be perverted for evil, and a reminder of the catastrophic failures of post-war global justice systems. His experiments, his trials of human endurance, his sadistic efforts to manipulate genetics, and the countless lives ruined in the pursuit of his grotesque ideals serve as an indelible part of the Holocaust's horrifying legacy. The final, tragic note of Mengele's life is a lesson in the nature of impunity and the cost of allowing evil to flourish unchecked. History shows us that when evil is allowed to hide in plain sight, as Mengele did for so many years, it poisons the fabric of human society. The failure to bring him to trial speaks to the larger failure of humanity to confront its own darkest impulses. Mengele's story is a grim reminder that there are no real victories in justice when those responsible for the worst crimes can escape their fate, leaving the memory of their actions to haunt the generations that follow. Ultimately, the legacy of Josef Mengele is not one that can be confined to the atrocities of the past. It's a legacy that must constantly be revisited, remembered, and taught. We must never forget the lessons of history, especially the lessons from the darkest chapters. The story of Mengele is a testament to the dangers of unchecked cruelty and the importance of upholding human rights, ensuring that such horrors are never allowed to rise again. While Mengele may have escaped formal justice, the moral justice he failed to avoid continues to reverberate. His name will forever remain synonymous with the ugliest face of humanity, and it is on us to ensure that it is not forgotten. Through books, films, survivor testimonies, and continued research, we ensure that the voices of his victims remain louder than the silence of his evasion. It's a commitment to humanity's collective conscience, so that history's darkest days remain a powerful reminder of the light we must always strive toward.